I now have great pleasure in introducing our first speaker for the day and welcome John Halliday, Chief Executive of Community Renewal Trust, to the stage.
Let me awkwardly get my presentation out just now. These presentations always begin with an awkward moment as we get them out. I'm also the sort of person who paces around this stage, so you're not going to be able to hear me, and then you're going to hear me really loudly, so apologies about that. About 14 years ago, I worked with a guy called Alistair Grimes on Mosley Street, and he always used to say, before you do a presentation of any sort, make sure you really need to go to the toilet, because that way your presentation won't go on a moment longer than you really need it to. But the loos are also upstairs here, so if you see me dashing out, even when the alarm goes off in a few minutes, the fire alarm is going to go off. It'll signal some sort of low point in my presentation. If you see me dash out, that's the reason why. I'm here at the beginning of the day to do just this, which is just set the scene, basically. Community Renewal Trust, I've also been going for about 20 years. I'll say in a minute about what we do. And we approached BFE in 2018 to say, what could we do together? How could we make this work as a programme? We'd not worked together. Community Renewal hadn't worked outside of Scotland. And this programme is more than a programme. It's about establishing a pattern of working that's a bit different. A pattern of working that could sustain in places, not only in Edinburgh, in the neighbourhood we're doing there, not only in Walker, in the neighbourhood where BFE are working, but it's a pattern of working that can be done elsewhere. That doesn't mean it's a project to replicate necessarily, but there's something to learn from it. And we didn't set this up blindly. We set this up based on 20 years experience in that space, trying to say what works, what doesn't work. How can you use community development ethos and approach and apply that to working in a whole place paradigm in a systematic way, and how can you do it so you're working holistically with people? How can the community development part of what we do inform some of the one-to-one work that we do? How can this become more than neighbourhoods where we have lots and lots of projects, all of which are on 3-year cycles, all of which kind of go through these phases of mobilisation, being delivered, they all steal each other's staff for a while, and then you kind of end, and then you do the next big thing. What can we do that establishes a pattern? And I think all I really want to do in my section today is set the scene for why it is that BFE have done more than just try to replicate what we've been doing. They've actually run off and done fantastic additional things. So the rest of the day in some ways is about saying, wow, they started with a small amount of ideas that we sort of brought, they combine it with their own expertise, and they've come up with so much more than the sum of those two parts. Just briefly about community renewal. So we have been going 20 years. This year, there's a little summary here of some of the big numbers. I promise I won't go through all these numbers. But broadly, we work in 3 neighbourhoods. We work in 2 neighbourhoods in Edinburgh, one of which is going to be the subject of everything I talk about for about half an hour just now. Another where we do the same stuff, but without the kind of learning element that this Lifting Neighbourhoods Together programme has allowed us to do. And we also lead in Govan Hill in Glasgow, the Community Development Trust for Roma people in Scotland, where we have a by-Roma, for-Roma approach, which means that, fortunately, my views count for little, because we try and give all the power there to the 12 or more Roma staff that we employ. We also run a couple of social enterprises, one that does consultancy, and one that delivers funerals for people, which is a fascinating bit, but I'll not talk about that. Anyway, we're really deeply proud of all that we do, and this is basically that everything we're going to talk about today, from our point of view, the Lifting Neighbourhoods Together process is all stuff that happens in 3 neighbourhoods that we describe as one neighbourhood, much to the chagrin of some of the neighbours there, of Bingham, Magdalen, and the Hayes. So if you hear me say those, that's all one place in Edinburgh. I'm going to start introducing this guy, Tony, just so as I start talking about the kind of theory of why we got to where we did about designing this approach. There's some sort of like a hook in your head that kind of is a bit more personal than a graph. It's a bit more personal than a sort of theoretical framework of how asset-based community development could be combined with one-to-one support. So Tony's quite typical. I mean, everyone's unique, but he's quite typical of the sort of person that you meet in deprived communities, where it really starts butting up against the immediate idea that someone comes in and says, we can lift this whole neighbourhood out of poverty. I do think that's true, but we come into a neighbourhood and we say, we think we could lift this neighbourhood out of poverty. What we need to do is get each person in that community out of poverty. You meet someone like Tony and you think, yeah, this is a long road. This takes a lot of work. We need to really think through what we're doing here. Tony's in his 50s, lives in a damp terrace house not far from our office in Bingham. He lives with his two teenage daughters, a sort of elderly dog. I'm only mentioning that because these things do make a big difference. I suppose something he loves doing, but also like a weight on his mind. You know, these are the things that make up life. How you care for people, how you act, what your passions are. Especially when you're stuck indoors all the time. One of Tony's kids, in the time that we've known him for a few years since the beginning of this program, one of his kids was actually taken into care. You can imagine the toll this took on him. But when Tony was himself a teenager, he'd actually been in prison for an extended period of time. Like, his life's quite hard. His experience of dealing with public services, and in his head, the difference between a charity and a public service are probably not too much difference there, is that this is a place that's really hard for him to work. He naturally, and probably reasonably, is skeptical of anyone who talks to him who's a professional. He actually sometimes gets aggressive, which I don't think is reasonable, but you can understand why. He's been treated appallingly by the state, and then the state can't cope with someone that responds in that way, with sort of hostility or anger, with frustration, where they're bringing up something that happened 30 years to them, but it's still pertinent to them. But people can't really deal with that. So I think it's fair to say, if we lined up all the many people in the public sector that Tony's dealt with in the last few years, people would generally be like, look, we're very sympathetic, but we really struggle, and it's kind of his deal. He needs to turn up to appointments. He can't act that way. It is a struggle. We have had these discussions ourselves. Is it okay for someone to work in a sort of, to bring that trauma and upset into work, into our workplace? He's depressed, he's in debt. I said he's living in damp conditions. He's lonely, he doesn't have money. Of course he doesn't have money, he doesn't work. He hasn't worked for ages. So what does he have? Well, he has a real motivation to do better by his daughters than his own life. And at first glance, not a lot else to build on. But we're going to build on, when we go to Tony, you might say, well, what would we want to do? We'd want to listen to some of this experience he has in his life and think about what he brings, what would motivate him to make a change. And really at first glance, maybe it's just around that bit of like, how could his daughter's life be better than his life? He's got a bucket load of problems in his housing, in his mental health, in his money, all these things. How's he going to have food? Actually, this case study started before we all started talking about cost of living crisis. I think it's pretty normal to say the sort of people and communities we all work in, the cost of living crisis is just the latest cost of living crisis, not the only one. So as we start thinking about the predicament that Community Renewal looked at and said, okay, we think we need to establish a new pattern of working in a different way that can do something about this, I want you to bear Tony in mind, and I'll come back to him at the end. So my first bit about the predicament we see happening when we deliver is this extremely stereotypical slide of silos. Right. If you asked an AI program to say, I need a slide that says the word silo for public sector silos, this is the sort of thing that comes up. So apologies not to be any better than ChatGPT, but there you go. We all, for years, have talked about silos. Silos are actually a really important bit of working in the public sector and in the third sector because it means that you can have specialists and you can make sure those specialists aren't wasting their time on things like booking appointments and, things that feel like a real waste of time. You can train them up, you can put all your eggs in that basket, and they're specialists. But if everything's a silo, we really get into problems. And it is absolutely cliche to say we see this all over the place. There's youth silos, there's silos around police and offending behaviors. Even sometimes community development, the place where we try to do the least amount of siloed working and the most around bottom-up work and holistic work across different disciplines, ends up sometimes being a wee silo of its own, depending on where you're based. Housing can become a silo. The support to make people less isolated or working with older people, two different categories, I just happen to lift them together, but these often silo. In Scotland, there's a great drive around ending child poverty, which means that families can receive a whole bunch of support, but someone who's thinking about having kids in 2 years' time is utterly ineligible for it. It creates a natural silo. It's not that silos are always bad, but we know there's silos all over the place. In every community we've worked in, and Community Renewal have worked in 17 neighbourhoods across Scotland, when we've tried to establish a pattern of working that combined community development and one-to-one work, you come across the fact that as you meet people one-to-one, you want to signpost them into support, you end up doing just that, signposting them. What a boring thing to do, just send them off to some other silo that can't really speak to you. These days, it's all about data is one of the big bits that people talk about, but it could just have been practicalities in the past. It could be that people are precious about their way of working. It's just a matter of life that there are silos. So we can rail against it, but we were saying, is there stuff we could do that means we could learn about this? How could we specifically learn about how to make it so people like Tony's life wasn't impacted by silos, even if they continue to exist? What would that take? And we're happy to stay in the space of what would that take? And if we can't do anything about it, that's all right, but like, what would it take to do something about that? If you ask ChatGPT to give you a stereotypical picture of what it's like to have sort of linear factory-like process that lots of services that want to deliver, lots of projects that deliver, lots of really excellent, well-funded, sorry, no one's well-funded these days, lots of projects that are successfully funded and deliver, they're really excellent, but you know, once people start working with someone's life tends to be that they are experiencing multiple different interventions at the same time. You can imagine how many interventions Tony is having at the same time, each of which has maybe in their head this model that they're going to take Tony in and they're going to turn him into someone who's not in poverty, who's happy, who's less isolated, whatever it is that's on their agenda. And at the beginning of that intervention, I can guarantee they did an assessment process. They probably did an eligibility check. And then they set off and they maybe tried to talk to each other a wee bit along the way, but there's kind of a linear mentality. You're like, this person's life's going to get better. And I just don't believe people's lives like Tony do just get better. Even with excellent support, things go up and down. People's lives are very, very changeable. Projects as well come and go. So it's not only that there's kind of silos happen, but as we deliver public services, as we deliver projects in the third sector, we sometimes end up in this pattern of we take everyone in, we assess them, we try to move them forward in life. Some people just disengage and we just don't talk about them very much. And some people, fortunately, do indeed come out of that better, which is great. But when we're doing that, we're kind of taking credit for something where there might have been 5 or 6 or 10 interventions in their life. And maybe the key one was actually their neighbour becoming more available to help them. How do we know? The third of the 4 bits on predicament, I'm summing up here to say, if someone's got a broken leg, it's clear what we should do. It's clear that someone with expertise needs to go in and try to fix that leg. They need to do the intervention that it takes to fix a leg, and then time will pass and they will get better. And that normally happens. There's a few exceptions, of course. But it normally happens. Humans, we quite like that kind of change. We quite like seeing that someone who's broken can become fixed. And we quite like, I think, maybe just catch yourself thinking that sometimes, we quite like that someone who's professional knows what they're talking about kind of comes in and is like, oh yeah, I know what to do there. Yeah, I can fix that leg. And part of that means that when people have complex lives where there's lots going on, we maintain that sense that wouldn't it be nice if there was like a quick fix here. I often get myself in a tiz by saying, you know, employment maybe is often the only option for people to get out of poverty. But in my heart, I know that's not quite right. I know there's not a quick fix here. It's much more complex. But the bit that's most important to me on here is the idea of there's professionals who can paternalistically help people in the community isn't always the way things can work. And if we take an asset-based community development mindset and start applying it to one-to-one interactions and delivering in a whole place in a systematic way, we start to say, no, we need to build people's capacity to fix themselves. It's not quite a perfect metaphor, but the doctor who fitted the cast onto someone's leg when it was broken didn't actually do the healing, did they? They just put some framework in place and their job was over 20 minutes later. I suppose someone else cut it open at the end. It's always good to watch those videos. They're very satisfying if you haven't had it done to yourself. The person had to do the healing themselves. Like that was all those days where they were like, oh, I can't really get off the sofa, I'm feeling a bit rotten today. It was all the compromises they made to not push themselves. That they had to do the healing. I mean, it's kind of a magic process, let's be honest. We don't need to know the details. You could do 4 biology degrees and you wouldn't really understand the process by which bone heals. But that's fine. We don't mind that that's complex. We don't mind that the person kind of did the work. But we sort of attribute the bit to the paternalistic person who came along and fixed them. Actually, there's sometimes more to it than that. And if we ditch a paternalistic mindset in which we try to fix people, we start to say, okay, how can we build someone's capacity to look after themselves? And then you remember Tony and you think, oh God, that's quite a long journey to help Tony help himself, isn't it? Where would you start? And the last bit in this predicament we really looked at was every community. I said we worked in 17 neighborhoods. Just under half of Community Renewal's life have I worked at Community Renewal. But for the 17 neighborhoods Community Renewal's been in, every time there's a bit of a pattern of, yeah, it's the same kind of neighborhoods we're working in. There's obviously a discrimination between different places. There's a difference in how you deliver services in different places. There's also a difference in what success looks like. we've sort of resigned ourselves to defeat of saying, yeah, there's certain places that are going to remain poor, even if the people in them don't. And it's not always true. There are people who live in deprived neighbourhoods all their life and do get a better life. But broadly speaking, when we've had a transformative effect on someone's life through the one-to-one work we've done with someone, they've normally left the neighbourhood they lived in. And they've often, but not always, been replaced by someone who is either formerly homelessness or has fallen on hard times. Maybe they've just gone through a relationship breakdown. Maybe they've just had bereavement. Maybe they've just had kids and they can't afford it anymore. And they move into that house. And it kind of perpetuates the place-based division. The same places remain poor for years, and it doesn't sit right with anyone. But our interventions need to reflect that there's complex stuff going on. And they particularly need to reflect the idea that as someone's life, we want them to transform in their experience of their life. We want them to be out of poverty. We want them to be living a quality life in which they are not isolated. They themselves feel like an asset. They have purpose in their life. We want all of those things in someone. We want them to go through that transformation, but we also want them to kind of be part of a place-based transformation that brings along their neighbours, because otherwise all the work we put into that person and all the work they put into their own journey gets kind of lost and they move somewhere else. What can we do about lifting neighbourhoods out of poverty that starts with lifting people out of poverty, but means they have a real deep connection to their place? And as we start talking about Walker, there are people who've lived in Walker for generations, lived in Walker all their life. Brilliant. We need to transform people like that in their life experiences, their sense of purpose, their sense of well-being, their finances. But we have to make sure that sense of pride and place is also reinforced by them having a deep connection, because some people have that and some people don't. So, obviously we're completely innovative in Community Renewal, only place that's ever thought about all of these issues and how we could fix it, except that everyone for 100 years has said the same thing, right? 13 years ago now, there are two more Marmot principles these days, but this is, 13 years old. The Marmot report has then had all this impact on public health and health inequalities, health equity, we say these days. I completely back the change to say health equity, by the way. We kind of know the things that we need to do better and do different. We all do, and it's been a really difficult place. We're not claiming we're saying something different. None of that predicament was stuff you didn't know or feel, I think it's fair to say. But often when we translate that into doing a project, we turn it into something that's really projecty, that tackles with just isolation, or it tackles just, putting money in people's pocket. Or we make it so it covers a big geographic area because, we need to spread it quite thinly in order to make it stack up financially. So Marmot, ourselves, or every single public sector agency has built in the idea that we want to see change happen. And we all basically think that changing the system in some ways is the answer. And in some ways, the question is about what are the enablers of making system change happen? What would happen that meant that there was a pattern of working from the public sector and third sector in places and with people that kind of meant that there was consistency, that there was movement across silos, that meant that there wasn't an endless cycle of people being assessed and moved on or signposted, that there was people built on this connection they have to the places they live, so they really felt part of that community and they were really embedded into helping their neighbours as well as themselves. And we did all of that while building on their capacities rather than trying to fix them. There's sometimes things you can fix, but build their capacities so they can look after themselves. Well, we've all been trying to do this, and it hasn't happened for... You snuck the next slide there. This is actually data from Glasgow. I've only got one graph. I promised myself I'll try to just stick to one graph per presentation because I love a graph. For decades, people's life expectations in terms of quality life years lived, declining morbidity, mortality, just the sense that people's lives would be longer and more of it would be spent in good health. Things have been looking up for decades. Even through Thatcher years, all the stuff we complain about, and quite rightly so, things have been getting better. Some of that's about quick wins. Public health will be the first to say, what about reduction in smoking in affluent communities, for instance, has made some real quick wins in this. But it's been a consistent pattern. And then since austerity came in, unquestionably and completely unsurprisingly, and as everyone said in 2010 and has been banging on since, things haven't been getting better, on average. They've got a wee bit worse. These are Glasgow stats rather than Newcastle stats. I felt like that made me more Scottish, if that's right. But that's not the big problem. The big problem is this graph is actually this. So the red line is the most deprived. Sorry, we're only looking at women here just because it's the stats that I thought best represented this from the Glasgow Centre for Population Health's recent report. So the red line is women in the most deprived neighbourhoods, and the green line is women in the least deprived neighbourhoods. So it's got worse for everyone, or at least, sorry, the improvement we've seen over decades has stopped for everyone. But it's got seriously worse for people in the most deprived neighbourhoods. Again, no one is absolutely surprised by this, but it goes against the flow of the fact that we feel like we know more and more about how we could beneficially improve communities. Lots of this can be explained by the fact that there's macroeconomic effects, right? There's benefits are worse. It's guaranteed that the reduction in benefits is causing some of this. It's baked in to everyone's equation. But we don't have all of the levers. We should absolutely be advocating for tax justice and improved benefits and things, don't get me wrong. But some of it's about, are we actually able to deliver change? And we need to deliver that with even less resource than previously, because more of the resource of government is going to crisis funding. There's just less available overall per capita. So it's really difficult. And we have a rather controversial way, I'm not sure this is actually controversial, but we have a way that's a little bit difficult of saying this, which is that poverty is complex, but the solutions don't have to be. Okay? You don't have to believe this. This isn't a cult, by the way. You can believe that poverty is not complex because it's basically government's fault. I think that's fair enough. You can believe that the solutions do have to be complex. That's fine. In fact, if you start delivering it, as we have in the Lifting Neighbourhoods Together programme in both Edinburgh and Newcastle, it's really difficult, actually. There's no two ways about it. Difficult, definitely. But is the actual way we work the bit that's difficult? Well, it's kind of, I do want to stress that as much as I believe this slide, I also believe this slide. This was the theme of last year's Lifting Neighbourhoods Together conference, basically. The theme was we found lots of people speak and say, well, from a commissioning point of view, the problem is we often make it so everyone should chase outcomes. But actually, life isn't like that. From a delivery team's perspective, sometimes the problem is we come up with a theory of change, and it makes it seem like if we put on this event, people will come, they'll be happier, their lives will be better, and they'll live longer, and there's a sort of myth bit there to the end. You know, life is more complex than that. And we had a series of people talk last year about this, and I really do believe this, but it's possible for this to be true, I think, and this to be true. And my example is that basically we're boiling down lots of predicament when we talk about lifting neighbours together into a few bits. We're boiling it down into this picture of a tea bag, actually. Did anyone spot the tea bag in the first picture? It's sort of just, you might not mention it, you might have spotted it, you might have thought, what weirdo. The tea bag's just saying, like, have a cup of tea with someone. You know, when someone comes in, let's have a different paradigm of getting to know people. When we know people and they trust us, and importantly, we trust them, and we're starting with a bit of a relationship, without an agenda, without us saying, well, we're here because we're the people who help your benefits go up. If we go in like that, then maybe we can get into discussions with people about their whole lives, and we can understand not everything about their life. You'll never meet someone and know everything about their life. But you know enough that you can help them help themselves in the most effective ways. Sometimes they don't want to be helped in those ways, and you might need to find a backup plan to help them with. Sometimes it's just about building their confidence. Maybe it's just about them airing their issues. But if we can start with relationships, and if we can do that on a one-to-one basis to try to lift individuals out of poverty, and at a neighbourhood level to start making it so we're lifting a whole neighbourhood out of poverty, all the better. And if there's enough workers working together in a neighbourhood, even if they're in the same team or near each other, that it means we could have human relationships between workers. So you're not signposting someone to a service delivered by someone else. You're saying, oh yeah, Betty, she knows that. I'll tell you what, I'll come in next week, or like I know her well, I'll just give her a ring. She'll be able to do a handover. If you know each other in that really normal human way, all the better. So many examples I see of people setting out to do some system change or respond to silos and that factory-like approach. Start by saying something like, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we do some mapping first? I don't know how many meetings I've been in where people say, let's do mapping. There is a time and place for mapping, there's a time and place for databases, don't get me wrong. But it can't be the be-all and end-all. We actually always operate on human relationships, and a big bit about what we're doing is that. So we send out staff and we say, look, we want you to engage people and try to build up trusting human relationships with people in the community with people delivering other services, and particularly with people in your team and local assets, volunteers who can really make a difference. And we want you to listen to them. We want you to connect them to all the different support they need in a non-signposting way. We want you to build on their strengths so they have more strengths, but also you're starting on the good stuff, not starting on all the things that are wrong in their life. And make sure that while you maybe can't support them intensively for a long time, because we don't have the resources that we really want to really quickly and easily end poverty, we can't do that intensively for everyone in a community, even if it's 4,000 to 10,000 people, which we think is about the scale at which this kind of stuff might work well. What we can do is we can say we'll stick with them. We'll stick with the place. We're not going to abandon our places. And BFE is a good example. You don't abandon the places you work in. And you say there's always a golden thread. People can come back whenever they want, and they'll still meet someone in that team that kind of knows them, that they've some connection to, they've some history with. These things can make a difference. So all of that background just sets us up to say, we proposed to the Lottery Fund UK portfolio that we did a 5-year experiment around this. And we did that in Edinburgh, in Bingham, Magdalen and the Hayes, and I'll give you a little update on that in a minute, and then Ancha's going to talk at length about the brilliant version of that I've been doing in Walker. And we need some partners. So we've got on board Sheffield Hallam University. You're going to hear from Ian this afternoon, who's doing more than just evaluation. They're actually a learning partner in this and trying to make a real difference to how we work. We've commissioned the Tavistock Institute to do some work around group dynamics. Just try to understand that actually sometimes these intuitive human connections come with baggage. You've got great relationships with loads of your friends. I bet you've whinged about them. Relationships come with baggage. Sometimes you need someone else to talk to about these things. Sometimes there's all sorts of other dynamics that come in. People bring their own mentality to things. It can make it difficult to work. So we're being helped through that and through some system change work. And the lottery gave us £2 million over 5 years to do this. And that makes it seem like we're doing some massive intervention in both communities, but we're really not, actually. It's just a few very small number of staff members in 2 neighbourhoods. And then a lot of time trying to work on learning and adapting and having a proper approach to system change and visioning. And these sound like things that aren't the most needed thing in a cost of living crisis. But we're in a massive, massive crisis nationally, in which inequality is growing, and however much we talk about health equity, we're getting in a worse and worse predicament, and it's a bigger and bigger hole to get out of, and those communities are more and more entrenched in poverty, and the same families will be trapped in persistent poverty. So how can we afford not to have some shaking up of the system, even at small levels, and even if it doesn't always work? So we've bloodied our nose loads on things that haven't worked. We've bloodied our nose lots on things where it has worked, but it was maybe a really difficult way of doing it. We're doing that because we think there was lessons to be learned there. We're in the midpoint of basically 3 years of delivery just now. It's a 5-year program, but realistically, the first 2 years were spent coping with COVID. I don't mind saying, and I could talk for another 2 hours about the COVID experience, and it was fascinating, and we've got a report about it, and it's really interesting, but it's not really something we should highlight today. What I want to highlight today is what in practice we do on the ground, and then make sure you understand in Ancha's presentation what's happening in Walker right live just now. So the community in Walker is 10,000 people that they're working with. Realistically, they're starting with about half that neighbourhood, if you see what I mean, because it's actually really difficult for a small team to get their heads around 10,000 people. If you imagine 10,000 people, if you're sat in St James's, you could maybe have a better idea of this. It's actually really hard to envisage 10,000 people. It's hard to know how to form connections. In Bingham, Magdalen and the Hayes, we have 4,000 people in that 3 neighbourhood area, which we call 1 neighbourhood. And it gives a sense that a team, and we have 7 people who are in our team, only 2 of which are lottery funded, in Edinburgh, that have come together, and they're working with in a neighbourhood about 4,000 people. It means they can kind of have a sense that they know someone on every street. If you don't know the person directly, you maybe met them at an event, or you know a neighbour, maybe you know their auntie who lives down the road, you've kind of a human connection to them. So we deliberately, after these 20 years experience at Community Renewal, picked these kind of small places that are manageably sized. We didn't pick places like saying, let's just do this across Glasgow, for instance. And we have set out in Bingham, Magdalen and Hayes, and for the next few minutes, I'm just talking about Bingham, Magdalen and Hayes to avoid spoiling Ancha's presentation. We set out to do whole person, whole place system change. So a whole person change, of course, we're just talking about being holistic. There's no clever language here, but just trying to get into all the different aspects of someone's life. We don't list them. We don't just sit there and say, yeah, come on. You've told me plenty about your housing. Let's talk about your debt and things. Kind of tease it out of them. So we need to listen to people and we need to tease them out of it, but it's not about listing things. So making sure we're dealing with the whole person. Sometimes that means just following where they want to talk about, what they want to do, building on stuff that they're interested in. You can imagine that Tony's very interested in his children, how to get back the child that went into care. He's very interested in how he makes both his teenage daughters' lives better. Like, get into this chat. What would it take? What are the things that are stopping that? Critically, I've used the word transforming a few times here. Lots and lots of the kind of linear projects that can only deal with one aspect of someone's life, even when they are absolutely delivered by people who are experts in their field and genuinely make a massive difference. Often they're not aiming for what I'd say was transformation. Transformation is a key word for us. When we meet someone let's say they're on the streets of Bingham, and we bump into them and we form a relationship and say, do you want to come and have a chat with us in the office over a cup of tea tomorrow? Yeah, let's come in. We need to, from the minute we meet them, have our spidey sense on to say how we're going to transform this person's life together. How we're going to be alongside them through a transformative process. Because it's one thing to say they had damp in their house and now they don't because I got in touch with the council and the housing officer sorted it. But unless that happens to be something that's utterly transformable in their life, we've missed the opportunity to get in a bigger chat with them about what would it take to have a much better life. So the approach we've brought and the bit where we've been trying to work with Building Futures East to, we don't want to teach grandma to suck eggs here. This is something where BFE bring a huge amount of experience in this space. But we have a specific approach that we think, in fact, we know through a lot of evaluation over a lot of years, teases these things out well with people while listening to them deeply. So we can deliver a holistic assessment, and I don't like the word assessment in that, we need to move it to holistic conversation, a holistic conversation with someone in which we can systematically listen to them deeply and pick out these things. And basically we spend as long as it takes with someone in a structured interview process, but in which we listen to them and let them lead, towards answering this question. You don't ask this question at the beginning, but everyone in this room, I hope, after some time having a chat with someone, would be able to answer this question about themselves, because no one is entirely satisfied in their own life. Is anyone 10 out of 10 happy? Well, maybe occasionally you feel that way. There's always things that could happen, and everyone we support ends up in a situation where really deep down they know life could be better, and often they know what it might take. They just know it deep down and they don't know it on the surface, if that makes sense. So we can talk to them until that happens. What would a much better life look like in 18 months' time? It's a really powerful question, but you can't just dump it on the table. You can't meet someone and say, I can help you with the benefits, and also, have you ever thought about what a much better life would look like? But if you do get them to the point of answering that question, it's extraordinarily powerful. But I keep talking about this balance between it being a sort of whole place or a community development approach and a one-to-one approach. So on the whole place aspect, it's worth saying, why are we delivering a whole place aspect? Well, two things. One is we know that if we transform people's lives, they might leave a place. So we should make sure that we're helping people engage in the place they're in. Another is that we want to be systematic about how we meet people. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. But we want to be systematic about how we meet people. We don't just want whoever most needs food parcels come to our door and we'll have a conversation with you. And we really believe that putting on things in the community that make the community better, whether it's group support, whether it's setting up self-sustaining group support, whether it's things that are sort of classes people can come to, whether it's events, make communities better and happier. They put the people who engage that in a better frame of mind. It creates opportunities for people you're supporting one-to-one to get engaged in delivering those. You know how often we end up where the person who's manning the barbecue at an event is actually someone who a few years ago would never have wanted to socialize with people. It's part of people's individual journey. And the whole place bit is because we're really interested in getting people to engage us. If we're going to start a relationship, we can't just meet someone on the street and say, I can help you with the benefits, do you want to come for a cup of tea tomorrow? It doesn't work. We need to meet people on the streets and say, oh yeah, Bingham's great, isn't it? What do you think's great? I really like it. I'm on your wavelength. And when they inevitably say, but the council litter collection's really rubbish, you can be like, yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah. no truck with us. We can get into a relationship. And if we invite people to a barbecue, if we invite people to an art class, if we invite people's kids round for us, as we did recently for sort of exploring in the woods. There's a little bit of woods on the side of the park near our office. Woods is really exaggerating here. It's a few trees. Get the kids in there, then maybe the parents could be engaged and we could have a chat with them. People we had never met before. So whole place coupled with the whole person means that we can make it so people are on a journey with their neighbourhood. We've a chance to make a whole neighbourhood lift out of poverty if we work with enough people in it. We make it so as people aren't leaving, but most importantly, we can systematically ensure we engage as many people as possible. That's it's simultaneously a quite complex way of working, and it's really hard, I'll tell you. Like members of teams delivering this find it hard to balance up. They're like, oh my God, I've got a meeting this afternoon with people in mental health crisis. I've got someone who's got zero money to live off for the next 3 weeks in an appointment. And what I'm doing at the moment is I'm trying to order sausages for the barbecue. Like, they're hard things to like juggle in your mind. But very much bringing together these kind of ways of working that we haven't been doing. It means we can be adaptable and learn. The picture on this side is of someone knocking a door. If it's one thing to say to a very, very busy staff member who's got a caseload of people they're supporting who are in urgent need, and you say, oh yeah, can you buy the barbecue sausages for next week or whatever, yeah, it's one thing. It's another to say, can you give up a good bit of your time, not half your time, but like a significant bit of your time, to knock on doors in the community. But we do this, we knock on doors and we talk to people. We do it to find relationships. Knocking on someone's door achieves prevention, early intervention. I have read so many high-level strategies of public agencies in which there's this great idea about how system change should shift it towards upstream issues that will mean that we embed prevention and early intervention. But by the way, there's almost no budget for that. But at the same time, we're definitely going to do it. And actually, at a local level, it's like as simple sometimes as being like, you know what, maybe we're not currently engaging the people who don't know it, but next year will face crisis. Let's just knock on their door. Like all the people who, if let's say COVID hadn't happened, but the cost of living crisis had, all those people who were suddenly struck by, oh my God, how do I pay my heating bill? We could have been chatting to them 2 years ago. That's actually what COVID did for us. We engaged people, all sorts of people who wouldn't normally seek support because suddenly COVID was huge. And we formed relationships with people who, as cost of living crisis stuff hit, we actually already had a wee bit of relationship. So simple, really quite intuitive things make a huge difference towards achieving these grand issues of, prevention, early intervention, Marmot principle aspects. And we do this through whole place support. I'm just going to give a couple of examples of this in Bingham as well, where we during COVID set up a community pantry. We did do a few deliveries and things, but we tried to resist the urge for a food bank. It's a difficult one because food banks do amazing work and should be celebrated for it. But we set up a community pantry in which people pay effectively a small amount for a lot of food. And we try to run it as best we can in the haze. It's all run by volunteers now. We're all right. It is really, honestly, run by volunteers. That wasn't meant to be cut off. And that's made a big difference. It's given like something that, again, we can use to engage people, because while people are using the pantry, we can go and chat to them. So there's other organizations like a digital support agency sits in there with us. We have staff just sitting there saying, do you want to chat with them? Do you want to chat? Often people don't. They're just coming in to get their food and then they leave. That's absolutely fine. It's not something where we have to give a deal, but we deal with people there. But it's also become a way in which we can help people by creating volunteering opportunities. We've set up outdoor classes, and again, we haven't delivered this ourselves, but we've put the work in to bring other organisations into the area. This is the sort of area where there's really not that much delivery traditionally. We've got another another organisation, it's a social enterprise in fact, to come in and do bike classes. And actually, it's not one of my key case studies here because it just happened yesterday, but in fact, the guy in the foreground in yellow just there, he came to a 6-week bike maintenance course. In the 3rd week, they got given a free bike. And now, about 6 months later, he's just got a job in maintenance, actually. So he's been out of work for a very, very long time with ill health. And his way in, he's been coming to our barbecues and stuff. He was sort of a client. His way in has been through this one course. So you never kind of know where this whole place stuff's going. There was an opportunity with an organisation. There were people in the area saying, yeah, I'd quite like something around, like a bit of hands-on joint. They weren't necessarily saying bike maintenance, but they want some kind of hands-on that they could do if you something. They do as a wee men's support group. And delivering it, you never know where it's going to go, these small group bits, but they can achieve transformative outcomes if in your mind, when you're doing it, you're thinking, we're not just trying to put this on for the sake of putting on another community activity. We've got some reason. We're trying to engage them in a discussion. We're trying to move them forward. And then we've done this added layer of trying to do system change over the top. So in some ways, what we've been doing so far is a hard version of one-to-one support and a hard version of community development work. And then we're trying to layer on this bit that's actually made it difficult, which is about system change. Some of that's been really successful. We've convened lots of groups. We ourselves go through visioning processes and strategy processes to try to say, how are we staying on track? We've used the wee tiny picture there is the 3 Horizons process, which is one of our kind of how you go about going around a visioning exercise to make sure you stay on track and you're taking the right route rather than the easy route, making the right decisions for people one-to-one rather than the quick decisions. We've catalyzed other little changes as well, like the example with the bus stop there is just the other day, we'd supported some community members to really rise up against the bus company taking away their bus connection to Asda. It sounds small, but actually like the idea that the community members are wanting to do system change stuff themselves, and that just sounds like protesting, right? But actually it was really important to them to have the sense that they deserve this, and actually they've been banging on the doors of the bus company, they're in the press, they've been meeting the bus company. We have community forum meetings at which we discuss the priorities in the local area, engage more people, and we've had a whole bunch of meetings with third sector organisations. We've got some really good stuff coming up with the recovery community and all the organisations that support people with substance misuse coming together in our neighbourhood where we work for the first time. It's a wider geographic group of organisations, but they've never thought to meet in our area before. It's just another neighbourhood that they've it's just a small blip in their agenda, but we've got everyone coming in to have a discussion with us, and we're bringing people with lived experience from our neighbourhood into that meeting so we can go about the process of becoming better joined up together in our place with people from the neighbourhood, and they can deeply know that. The other aspect of system change that we'd embedded into our programme was that we said we're going to have a couple of staff members who are funded by the lottery. That gives us the kind of capacity to start thinking differently and not just be trying to chase our tails, just trying to keep doors open and these issues that face all third sector organisations just now. But we're going to use this where we start forming a team. So we've flip-flopped on the language a bit. We started talking about secondments or time donors. We're going to take people who are funded in our own organisation through other work streams and other projects and other funders, and we're going to try to make them work in this team. So when we talk about Lifting Neighbourhoods Together in Bingham, Magdalen and Hayes, it's a couple of staff members who are funded by the lottery, and then there's currently 6 other people in that team that are actually come from different funded projects and things. And what they can do is they can bring the baggage of those funded projects and that they need to do certain KPIs and things in order to make that work, but they can do it in this paradigm. And that's been working really well to a point. It's been working really well. It's been making it so we take people who would have done a boring service that would indeed have met its targets and things and do it in a way that actually makes more transformative, sustained change. I'm not here saying we've immediately then with 7 people lifted entire neighbourhoods out of poverty. We're not at that stage. We're some way away from that. But we'll learn about what that change would be. And Ian's going to talk this afternoon that that's actually a really difficult thing. Combining projects with different funding KPIs, different restrictions, different eligibilities is really difficult. And again, last year's presentation, particularly from Toby Lowe from the Centre for Public Impact, was basically saying, commissioners, if only they'd got out of everyone's way a little bit, more of the right choices could have been made rather than doing things for the sake of paperwork. The bit that we found hard as well is that our initial ambition was for this team to be made significantly bigger with, say, another 5, 6, 7 staff members who were seconded in or time donated in from other third sector organisations or the public sector. We've had little bits of success in that. Actually, Ancha's had more success in the last year here, and I'll let her talk about that. But sorry, I'm pointing. Sorry, I'm pointing the wrong table. And she can talk about that. This has been a hard space. The public sector's in a bad situation just to try to keep their doors open at the moment. This is hard, and what was a reasonable ask in 2019, where, for instance, in Edinburgh, we had 13 people lined up to join our team from the public sector. By COVID, that wasn't happening. The public sector were like, oh, no, we'll just finish this crisis first, thanks. And then realistically, at the minute, there's not capacity. There's a recruitment retention crisis in the third sector, but it's as bad in the public sector as well. Sometimes we find there's whole teams with whole activities in Edinburgh, where there were 5 people and there's 1 person in post just now, and they say, yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to spend more time in Bingham. I've got a citywide role. It's really difficult. But how do we cope with that? Well, one way, and I've just drawn to a close with 3 slides here, about kind of where our learning's at. One way is we just need to keep banging on about it. That there is an attribution. I certainly didn't draw this myself. I think I saw this on online the other day. There's an aspect to which, however well-meaning we are, we're going to end up needing to fish people out of this river who found themselves drowning. And there's a lot of people who've been drowning during COVID, and there's a lot of people who are drowning during a cost of living crisis. And that was already happening before either of those things, particularly in places like Bingham, particularly in places like Walker. And we just need to keep coming to the idea of someone needs to do the upstream work to try to stop this happening. And if not us, then who is a big question I keep going around asking. Who else is responsible for the prevention, early intervention stuff, apart from the people who already are dealing with the crisis bit? If we can't make it that those of us who have a role to respond to crisis also recognize that we have to do at least some early intervention work, have to do some kind of system change work, have to make sure we're doing learning and adapting programs. It doesn't need to be at the kind of scale we're trying to do, but like have that sense that we just need to learn and adapt rather than just plaster, put sticking plasters on everything. If we can't keep banging on about that and taking some responsibility that we do that ourselves, I just don't know who's going to do that. We can't wait for some saviour, massive government programme to do that anymore. I just don't believe, even under a Labour government, there's some single programme that's going to come along and relieve all of our early intervention, prevention agenda issues. And part of the reason we need to think that is, if you were in our team, you're working in our office, either in Treetops or you're working in our Bingham office next to the community centre, and you're in our team and you think, okay, I've got a whole place agenda. I'm meant to work in a space in which we have these lovely listening conversations. How do you respond to someone who comes to the door and asks this obvious question? All I'm after is a food parcel, please. Like they're obvious, like no one asks for a food parcel who's not in need. It's worth saying. Like I have no sense that people are trying to pull a fast one. They're obviously in need. You want to help. You're someone who can be bothered to work for the third sector and is passionate about values-based, purposeful work. What do you do? Because people don't come to the door and say things like, I'm really worried that my relationship's on the brink of breaking down and that might have implications for my housing tenure. If I fall into debt, I might get into a wee bit of a spiral that means that in 5 years I'm in serious entrenched poverty and my kid's life could never get better. They just don't come out with those issues. They come out with questions like this. And if we say, yeah, okay, here's a food parcel, thanks very much, we do achieve some trust with them because they asked us a question, we gave it back. But then tomorrow, like 3 or 4 people say, yeah, you're the food parcel place, right? Yeah, thanks, me too. And that person just goes away with their food. It is really hard, and you need an established methodology, and you need ways of checking in with yourself and your team members to stop working in this paradigm and to work in any other paradigm in which you could maybe respond to crisis when people that you have a relationship talk about it. But you're not just being there as the responsive people who, because you deeply care and you're so compassionate, you end up kind of entrenching this problem. And you never have time to knock on a door, so you never find the family who says, yeah, I'm doing all right just now, but it does feel a wee bit like I'm on the brink of something. And you say, hi, do you want to come and have a tea next week? You can make more transformative impact with that other family. And if you're going to make transformative impact with this lady here, you need to think what your questions are. And probably she said this after you said, she knocked on the door, she walked in. This woman looks very surprised, I think it's fair to say. It must be Friday at 4 o'clock. I think that's probably what's going on. Hello, how can I help you? This is the sort of question GPs always ask. Hi, how can I help you? But hidden in there are all the paradigm problems at the beginning. How can I help you? It's like, I'm going to try to do this myself. I'm not part of some greater whole. You're asking like for them to diagnose themselves with a single thing. So of course they say something like food parcel. And you're saying, how can I help you? Like, you've come to me for help and I shall fix that thing if I can. So even in the way we ask the initial question, no wonder people come out with a second one. This is why we need to be in the space of like, want to come in for a tea? If it's 1 minute to 5 on a Friday, we might say, do you want to come for a tea next week? Let's be honest. But being in that space, and it's in those small interactions. I'm going to end with Tony's situation. The massive change for Tony is he managed to get, at least temporarily anyway, let's hope this lasts, he managed to get his child out of care. Okay, I'm back at home. It doesn't make his life easier in some ways. It makes it better, and who wouldn't want their child to come out of care? And by the way, the public sector will be unbelievably saving money because of that decision. It doesn't make it easier. Like, it turns out he didn't have enough beds in his house and things. He didn't have the right furniture. He didn't have all sorts of things. His house was already rubbish, already had damp. He already had issues. He already couldn't afford to pay for things. So more work was actually needed to kind of just sustain something there. So after a long period of time, of course, lots got sorted. But this stuff takes ages. His damp needed to be sorted. It was sorted. He needed food. He became a pantry member. He had emergency issues in his kitchen, so he needed a little bailout grant at one point. His daughter ended up coming for a lot of work. He actually went through this whole process of sorting out an exercise regime so he could feel a wee bit more out there. It turned out a big turning point was actually that having a conversation, when we went to his GP and had a conversation that said basically actually his health issues, there is something going on and his medication's potentially wrong. Actually it unlocked both a whole bunch of new support, but also his medication got sorted. His life's unquestionably better, but it's not fixed. I couldn't look at Tony and say, yeah, look at how Lifting Neighbourhoods Out of Poverty works. You help one person, they're out of poverty, that's sorted. Nice linear process, and then another 3,999 people, and then we're sorted, right? It doesn't work like that. Like, Tony's still in a difficult place. But I raise his case study specifically on the basis of saying, we've done unbelievable amount of change that responds to barriers in his life. We've done a huge amount of work to build his capacity to look after himself. And still his life's in a difficult place. And still he's struggling to engage. A big breakthrough again is that he doesn't turn up as often. That sounds really like I don't want him to come to our door. Of course we do. But he can't come every week and things. But he's chosen not to come as often because he's a wee bit able to stand on his own 2 feet a little bit now. That's a big breakthrough. His life can transform significantly because it's at such a difficult place. His ability to engage public sector services is transformed. To some degree, there's things in his life that have gone through transformative process. We need to keep in mind that we need to keep on that journey with him. But I most want to raise this example of saying this isn't an easy road. Poverty is complex. The solutions don't have to be, but they're not always solutions. And I'll tell you now, taking the difficult but right road is sometimes a really difficult road to take. It's one that has these huge compromises about how do I compassionately say no to someone who comes to my doorstep who I don't know, who's presenting in crisis, when I need to support people in a transformative way long term. Balancing these things up are really difficult. And I think it's fair to say that we found a kindred spirit in BFE. There's a breakout session a wee bit later. I'm just going to finish and I'll introduce Sancho. 1 second.
I'd just like to ask a question because it seems very cis-centric and very white, the slideshow you...
All right, thank you. Do come and have a chat with me in a second. I'm very grateful for you having a chat. We wanted to find an organisation that we could work with. And my process for that, I think a normal way of doing that these days is what you do is you cast the net wide and you say we're going to be really fair and have some sort of application process. This is how a commissioner procurer would go about this. We know what we want to do in Edinburgh. We want to find another place that could do this in. And we could be basically like a cookery school and kind of do a wee bit of teaching of some of the basic techniques and then send them off to do their own cooking in whatever style they want. What we could have done was have this kind of application process. That would have been the traditional way of doing it. But instead, and you might think this makes it seem like it's a real stitch-up, I was like, well, look, I'm from Benton myself. I knew places and people in Newcastle. I'd worked with them. I was involved in setting up something called Building Better Opportunities a few years ago, so we worked with 43 partners there. I was looking for places and organisations that we could trust. So where the need was obviously there, that's easy to do from a map. But where are the people that can go on this journey with us? And in doing that, we found BFE. We also found other organisations, by the way, that we also really wanted to work with, it's fair to say, and so apologies we could only work with one. But where do you find your co-adventurers? And we really found one, I think it's fair to say, in BFE. So I'm delighted that after this breakout group, that I think it's Helen's going to come on in a second to sort of a breakout group, that it's Building Futures East that are going to say how they went ahead and learnt from our approach, but then did their own amazing work, frankly, in the last few years. So hopefully you know a little bit about where the background of this came from. Hopefully you've seen some of the work we've done in Bingham. And now we're going to have a wee breakout group because we think it's useful for you to have a chat, and I'm happy to come and chat to you as well, about things how this affects you before you hear from some of the excellent work that's been happening in Walker. So thanks ever so much for listening to that, and look forward to hearing Antje's presentation in a few minutes. Thanks.